Picture this. It's a warm afternoon in 1200 BCE, and you're standing on the docks of Ugarit, one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world. Ships from Egypt, Cyprus, and Mycenaean Greece crowd the harbour. Merchants are shouting in half a dozen languages. The air smells of cedarwood, olive oil, and the sea. Bronze gleams everywhere on weapons, on tools, on the fittings of ships. This is civilization at its peak. 3,000 years of continuous development, writing systems, international law, trade networks that stretch from Britain to Afghanistan, indoor plumbing in palaces, diplomatic marriages between royal families who've been corresponding for generations, and then, in the blink of an eye, historically speaking, it's all gone. Within 50 years, almost every major city you can see from those docks will be burning. The kingdoms will collapse. The trade networks will shatter. Writing will disappear from entire regions for 400 years. Population will crash by 75% in some areas. It's as if someone just turned off civilization like a light switch. This is the Bronze Age collapse, and it remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in all of human history. Why did the entire Mediterranean world just stop working around 1177 BCE? That's the question we're diving into tonight. And if you're using this video to help you fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly what it's for, so maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love checking those. It's amazing seeing people from Tokyo to Toronto all exploring ancient mysteries together. Tonight, we're going on a journey through a world that vanished. We'll experience what Bronze Age civilization looked like at its height, understand how these sophisticated systems actually worked, watch as the cracks begin to appear, and then witness the cascade failure that brought it all crashing down. We'll explore the theories about what really happened, experience the dark age that followed, and discover how humanity rebuilt from the ashes. Because here's the thing that should fascinate you. These weren't primitive people. These were civilizations as complex as anything that would exist for another 1,000 years, and they just disappeared. So let's go back, way back, to a world of bronze and palaces and international intrigue to discover what our ancestors built and how it all fell apart. It's 1400 BCE, and the Bronze Age world is at its absolute peak. If you could somehow view the Mediterranean and Near East from above, you'd see something that wouldn't exist again for over 1,000 years. An interconnected system of kingdoms, all trading, all communicating, all dependent on each other in ways both obvious and hidden. This is the world before it fell, and it's more sophisticated than you probably imagine. Let's start in Egypt because that's where the best records survived. You're in Thebes, during the reign of the New Kingdom pharaohs. The city sprawls along both banks of the Nile, and it's massive. Over 100,000 people live here. The temple complexes are the largest buildings on Earth. Karnak alone covers over 200 acres. Its hypostyle hall has 134 columns, each one 69 feet tall. The ceiling is painted with stars. The walls are covered in hieroglyphics recording the deeds of pharaohs going back centuries. But Egypt isn't isolated. It's the anchor of an international system. In the palace archives, scribes maintain correspondence with their counterparts across the known world. These are the Amarna letters, though they won't be called that for another 3,000 years. They're diplomatic messages written in Akkadian, the international language of the Bronze Age, on clay tablets that can survive fire, flood, and millennia of burial. The letters reveal a world of constant negotiation. The pharaoh addresses his fellow great kings as brothers. The king of the Hittites in Anatolia, the king of Mitanni in northern Mesopotamia, the king of Babylon, the king of Assyria, the king of Elashia, which is Cyprus. These aren't just pleasantries, these are working relationships maintained over generations. They arrange marriages between royal families. They exchange gifts so valuable they're essentially tributes. They request specialists, physicians, architects, artisans. They settle disputes. They maintain peace. And they trade. Oh, how they trade. Because here's what makes the Bronze Age world work. Bronze itself. Bronze is an alloy, a mixture of copper and tin, usually about 90% copper and 10% tin. It's harder than pure copper, holds an edge better, and can be cast into complex shapes. It's the most important material in the world, and making it requires something unprecedented in human history. Long-distance trade. The copper comes from Cyprus mostly. The island's very name means copper in ancient languages. Mines there have been operating for centuries, producing ingots that weigh about 60 pounds each, shaped like stretched animal hides with handles on the corners so two people can carry them. These ingots are loaded onto ships and sent across the Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found shipwrecks carrying hundreds of them. But tin is the problem. Tin is rare. There are no significant tin sources in the eastern Mediterranean. The tin has to come from either Afghanistan, over 2,000 miles away, or from Cornwall in Britain, even further. Think about what this means. To make bronze in Mycenaean Greece, you need copper from Cyprus and tin from the other side of the known world. The trade routes cross mountains, deserts, and seas. They pass through dozens of kingdoms and territories. Any disruption anywhere along those routes and your bronze supply is in trouble. Now head north and west to Mycenaean Greece. This is the world that would inspire Homer's epics. Though those won't be written down for another 700 years, the great citadels crown hilltops across the Greek mainland. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes. These aren't cities in the modern sense. They're palace complexes surrounded by massive fortifications. The walls at Tiryns are so thick, over 20 feet in places, that later Greeks would call them Cyclopean, meaning they thought only giants could have built them. The stones are so precisely fitted that you can't slide a knife blade between them. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its carved lionesses flanking a pillar, weighs over 20 tons. You're a scribe at the Palace of Pylos on a spring day in 1200 BCE. You don't know it, but this palace has about 5 years left before it burns. Right now, though, it's the centre of a thriving kingdom. You work in a small archive room, surrounded by shelves of clay tablets. The tablets are unfired, just sun-dried, because they're temporary records. At the end of the year, they'll be thrown out and new ones made. Ironically, the fire that destroys the palace will bake these tablets hard, preserving them for archaeologists 3,200 years later. Your job is to track everything that flows through the palace economy, and I mean everything. You record how many sheep each shepherd is responsible for. You note which ewes produced lambs this spring and which didn't. You track textile production, how many spinners are working, how much wool they've processed, what types of cloth they've produced. You record bronze allocations, which smiths received how much metal, what they made with it, weapons, tools, vessels, fittings for chariots. You track food supplies, how much grain is in storage, how much wine, how much oil, where it came from, where it's going. And you do this in Linear B, a syllabic script that represents the earliest form of Greek we can read. Each symbol represents a syllable, and you combine them to write words. It's cumbersome compared to alphabetic writing, which won't be invented for another 400 years, but it works. The tablets show a world of staggering complexity. The palace at Pylos directly controls over 50 villages. It employs thousands of workers in specialized roles. There are perfume makers, unguent boilers, goldsmiths, and bronzesmiths. There are bath attendants and chair makers. There are dozens of different types of textile workers, spinners, weavers, fullers, finishers. This isn't a simple agrarian society. This is a sophisticated palace state with a bureaucracy that would impress modern governments. And it's all centralized. Everything flows to the palace and is redistributed from there. There's no market economy in the sense we'd recognize. No coins, no shops, no merchants operating independently. The palace is the economy. Now travel further east to the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, modern Turkey. Hattusa, the capital, sits at over 3,000 feet elevation in the central Anatolian plateau. It's a vast site, covering over 400 acres within its walls. The fortifications are stunning, with towers every 100 feet, and a tunnel through one section so the defenders can sortie out unseen. The Great Temple dominates the lower city. It's surrounded by storage magazines that could hold enough grain to feed the city for years. The royal archives contain thousands of tablets in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system invented in Mesopotamia 2,000 years earlier and adopted across the Near East. The Hittites are a military powerhouse. They fought Egypt to a standstill in Syria at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE. The battle was indecisive, but the peace treaty that followed is one of the most important diplomatic achievements in history. Copies survive in both Egyptian and Hittite, nearly identical, establishing mutual defense pacts, extradition agreements, and border settlements. It's diplomacy at the highest level. But the Hittite economy, like all Bronze Age economies, depends on the palace system. The king controls vast estates worked by dependent labourers. He allocates resources to his nobility, who in turn control their own estates and workers. Specialist bronze smiths. potters, weavers, scribes are attached to the palace or to noble households. They receive rations in exchange for their work. South of the Hittites in northern Syria sits Ugarit, the city we started with. It's smaller than the great capitals, but incredibly wealthy because of its position. Ugarit is where inland trade routes from Mesopotamia meet the sea. Merchants from Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire pass through here. Ships from Egypt, Cyprus, Crete, and Mycenaean Greece dock in its harbour. The palace archives at Ugarit, when archaeologists finally excavate them, will be a treasure trove, letters in 8 different languages, legal documents, administrative records, literary texts including some of the earliest religious writings outside Egypt and Mesopotamia. The merchants of Ugarit are sophisticated traders who can do business in multiple languages and multiple writing systems. And then there's Minoan Crete, or rather its fading remnants. By 1400 BCE, Minoan civilization has already passed its peak. The great palace at Knossos was damaged, possibly by earthquake or invasion, and Mycenaeans from mainland Greece have taken control. But the palace complex remains astounding. Multi-story buildings with advanced hydraulics, indoor toilets with running water, elaborate frescoes showing bull-leaping ceremonies, religious processions, dolphins swimming through underwater scenes. The trade connections between all these kingdoms create a web of interdependence. Egyptian gold flows north and east, Cypriot copper goes everywhere. Mycenaean pottery, beautiful stirrup jars decorated with octopi and abstract designs, shows up in sites from Sicily to the Levant. Baltic amber from the shores of the far north appears in Egyptian tombs, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, intense blue and streaked with gold pyrite, decorates palaces across the Mediterranean. And the people at the top of these societies live lives of extraordinary luxury. You're attending a feast in a Mycenaean palace. The Megaron, the Great Hall, is impressive. A central hearth burns in the middle. 4 wooden columns painted red support the ceiling. The walls are frescoed with hunting scenes and religious processions. The floor is plastered and painted with geometric patterns. The feast includes roasted meat, of course, sheep and goat and pig, probably some cattle, which is expensive because cattle require more grazing land. There's bread made from wheat, not the barley that most people eat. There's cheese, there are olives and olive oil. There's wine, lots of wine, stored in those large stirrup jars and served in gold cups. The cups are works of art themselves, embossed with scenes of capture bulls or naval battles. Musicians play lyres and flutes. Servants, dependent workers attached to the palace, move among the guests. The elite wear fine textiles, linen from Egypt perhaps, or wool processed and woven by the palace textile workers, dyed with expensive purple from murex shells or red from madder root. They wear gold jewellery, signet rings, necklaces, bracelets. They smell of perfumed oils, cedar and rose and myrrh. But underneath all this sophistication, all this wealth and artistry and international connection, there's a fundamental fragility. These palace economies have no redundancy. If the palace falls, the entire system collapses. The specialised workers depend on the palace for their rations. The bronzesmiths can't get metal without the palace trade networks. The textile workers can't get wool without the palace shepherds. Everyone is locked into a system with the palace at the centre. And the whole thing depends on bronze continuing to flow, which means it depends on trade routes remaining open, which means it depends on political stability across thousands of miles, which means it depends on climate remaining favourable enough to support the agricultural surplus that funds everything. There are a lot of dependencies in that chain, and in 1250 BCE, the chain is about to start breaking. So let's dive deeper into how these palace economies actually worked, because understanding the system is crucial to understanding why it failed so catastrophically. We need to see not just the grand palaces and international trade, but the daily mechanics of how Bronze Age civilization functioned at ground level. Take the palace at Pylos again. The Linear B tablets from its final year of existence give us an extraordinarily detailed snapshot of a Bronze Age economy in action. When archaeologists deciphered these tablets in the 1950s, they revealed something nobody had quite expected. This wasn't a primitive tribute system. This was complex economic planning that required literacy, numeracy, and bureaucratic organisation. Here's how it worked. The palace controlled directly or indirectly virtually all economic activity in its territory. It owned vast flocks of sheep, tens of thousands of them, distributed among shepherds in different villages. Each shepherd was responsible for a specific number of animals. The tablets record this precisely. This shepherd has 120 ewes and rams. This one has 83. This one has 247. Every spring, the shepherds had to report how many lambs were born. The palace wanted to know which ewes produced and which didn't, because unproductive animals were culled. The wool from these sheep, sheared every year, was the foundation of a massive textile industry. Women, thousands of them, worked as spinners and weavers, most of them dependent labourers who received rations from the palace in exchange for their work. The tablets list them individually sometimes. 37 women at this location working as spinners, 21 women here working as weavers. Each group has an overseer, also noted in the records. The wool is allocated by weight. This group receives 42 units of wool. That group receives 36 units. They're expected to produce specific quantities of cloth by specific deadlines. The finished cloth is collected by the palace and stored in magazines. Some of it is kept for local use. Palace elites need fine textiles. Religious ceremonies require special garments, but much of it enters the trade network. Mycenaean textiles are valuable commodities, traded across the Mediterranean for goods the kingdom needs but doesn't produce, like tin for bronze. Bronze production is similarly organised and controlled. The palace owns the copper, acquired through trade with Cyprus. It owns the tin, acquired through trade networks reaching to Afghanistan or Britain. The raw materials are allocated to bronze smiths in measured amounts. The tablets record this. This smith receives 3 kilograms of bronze. That smith receives 5 kilograms. They're expected to produce specific items: spear points, sword blades, arrowheads, agricultural tools, vessels for storage or serving. When the smiths finish their work, the finished objects are collected and inventoried. The tablets list military equipment with particular care: 300 arrowheads type A, 120 spearheads type B, 40 swords, long blades. This isn't just record keeping, this is logistics. The palace needs to know its military capacity precisely. And all of this, the sheep, the textiles, the bronze work, the agricultural production, it all feeds into a redistribution system. The workers don't own their production. They receive rations instead. The tablets specify what people get: wheat, barley, wine, olive oil, figs, olives. The amounts vary based on status and role. Skilled artisans get more than basic labourers. Men typically get more than women, which tells us something about Bronze Age gender economics. Children get smaller rations. But here's what makes this system simultaneously impressive and terrifying. There's no market mechanism. No one can just go buy what they need. There are no coins. Money as we understand it doesn't exist yet. Everything is allocation and redistribution. You get what the palace gives you. If you're a bronze smith, you can't just acquire copper and tin on your own and start making tools to sell. The copper and tin flow through the palace. If you're a shepherd, the sheep aren't yours. They belong to the palace. You're managing them. This creates a society with very little economic flexibility. But it allows for incredible coordination and planning. The palace can mobilize resources on a massive scale. Need to outfit a military expedition. The palace can pull together weapons, armor, chariots, supplies for hundreds of soldiers. Need to complete a major building project. The palace can allocate workers, materials, food for those workers, all in planned quantities. The Hittite Empire operated on similar principles, though with some variations. The Hittite king sat at the top of a feudal-style hierarchy. He controlled vast royal estates and allocated other lands to his nobility in exchange for military service. The nobles, in turn, controlled their own estates and dependent workers. When the king needed an army, the nobles had to show up with their contingents, equipped and ready. The Hittite archives reveal constant attention to resource management. One tablet records the king redistributing workers from one estate to another to balance population. Another lists supplies for a military campaign: thousands of loaves of bread, hundreds of jars of wine, specific quantities of meat. The logistics are staggering. The campaign might involve 10,000 soldiers or more. They all need to eat every day. The supplies have to be pre-positioned along the march route. In Ugarit, the system was slightly different because of the city's role as a trading hub. There seems to have been more independent merchant activity. But even there, the palace played a central economic role. The king collected taxes, controlled major industries like purple dye production from murex shells, an incredibly expensive commodity, and maintained the port facilities that made trade possible. The purple dye production is worth examining because it shows how Bronze Age industry worked. Murex shells, sea snails, produce a substance that can be processed into a purple dye of extraordinary quality and colour fastness, but it takes about 12,000 snails to produce 1.4 grams of pure dye. Enough to colour a single garment requires massive quantities of shells. The smell of the processing is apparently horrendous, rotting sea snails left to decompose in pits. Entire neighbourhoods of Ugarit were dedicated to this industry, with archaeological remains showing massive heaps of crushed shells. The finished dye was incredibly valuable. Purple cloth was a luxury item traded across the entire Mediterranean. Only the very wealthy could afford it. The colour became associated with royalty, and would remain so for thousands of years. Roman emperors would wear Tyrian purple, Byzantine rulers would use it as a symbol of imperial authority. All of this traces back to Bronze Age workshops processing millions of snails. But every aspect of this production, from gathering the snails to processing them to weaving and dyeing the cloth to trading the finished product, was organised by the palace or by merchants working under palace authority. Individual enterprise, in the sense of someone independently deciding to go into the purple dye business, didn't really exist. Now let's talk about what all this meant for daily life if you weren't part of the palace elite. If you were a textile worker in Pylos, probably a woman, your day started early. You live in a small house, maybe shared with extended family in a village a few miles from the palace. The house is simple, 1 or 2 rooms, stone foundations with mud brick walls and a thatched roof. There's a hearth for cooking and heat, basic pottery for storage and serving, a loom for weaving, the same type of technology that's been used for thousands of years. You walk to the workshop complex near the palace. Dozens of other women are already there. You're given your allocation of wool, already spun into thread. Your task is to weave it into cloth of a specific type. The overseer checks your work. The palace has standards. The cloth needs to be a certain weight per unit area, a certain tightness of weave. If you fail to meet the standards, your rations might be reduced. You work through the morning. The repetitive motion of passing the shuttle through the warp, beating down the weft, is meditative in its way, but also physically demanding. By midday you stop for a meal, probably barley porridge with some olive oil, maybe some vegetables if they're in season. Then back to work until late afternoon. At the end of the day, you return to your village. You receive your ration of grain from the palace stores, measured out by another bureaucrat with another tablet recording the transaction. You prepare the evening meal for your family. Maybe your husband works in the fields on palace land, growing the wheat and barley that feeds everyone. Maybe he's a shepherd. Maybe he's a labourer on one of the building projects that never seem to stop. Your children, if you have them, will probably follow similar paths. Your daughters will learn to spin and weave. Your sons will learn farming or herding, or whichever craft their father practices. Social mobility is limited. You're born into a role and you stay in it. But you're not enslaved exactly. The terminology is important. You're a dependent labourer. You're attached to the palace. You can't just leave and set up somewhere else. But you're not chattel property. You have a defined relationship with the palace that includes obligations and entitlements. You owe labour. The palace owes you rations and protection. And here's the crucial thing. This system worked. For centuries, it worked. The palace economies of the Bronze Age sustained large populations, produced remarkable art and architecture, maintained trade networks across thousands of miles, fought wars, made peace, and created a complex international order. The standard of living for common people probably wasn't high by modern standards, but it was stable. Famine was rare when the system functioned properly. Warfare existed but was somewhat regulated by diplomatic conventions between the great powers. But the stability depended on everything continuing to work. The harvest needed to be good enough to support the dependent workers and the palace bureaucracy and the military and the building projects. The trade routes needed to stay open so bronze could keep flowing. The international system of great powers needed to maintain its balance so that no one kingdom became powerful enough to disrupt everyone else. And increasingly in the 1300s and 1200s BCE, the system was becoming more complex and more fragile. Population was growing, which is actually a sign of success. More people meant more workers, more soldiers, more production. But it also meant the system had less slack. A bad harvest that might have been manageable when the population was smaller could become a crisis now. The palace bureaucracies were growing too. More scribes, more supervisors, more administrators. This is a classic pattern in complex systems. As organizations grow, they require more overhead just to maintain themselves. A larger percentage of the economic output has to go toward administration rather than direct production, and the trade networks were becoming simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable. Ships were getting larger, carrying more cargo, making the voyages more profitable, but this meant more capital tied up in each voyage. The loss of a single ship carrying 200 copper ingots could represent a significant economic blow. The diplomatic system was also showing strain. The Amarna letters from the 1400s and 1300s BCE show increasing tensions. Kings complain about gifts that aren't lavish enough. They quibble over diplomatic precedents. They make demands that seem unreasonable. One king refuses to send his daughter to marry the pharaoh unless he gets to see the pharaoh's daughter who married his father, to make sure she's being treated well and is actually still alive. These might seem like petty complaints, but they reflect deeper issues. The international system depended on trust and reciprocity between royal families who might be separated by months of travel time. You're making agreements with people you've never met, based on letters and the testimony of ambassadors. Any breakdown in trust could cascade into wider problems. By 1250 BCE, all these vulnerabilities existed in the system, but the system was still functioning. The palaces still stood, the ships still sailed, the scribes still recorded everything on their tablets, the bronze smiths still worked, the shepherds still tended their flocks. To someone living then, it probably seemed like this was just how the world worked, and always would work. They had no idea that within a generation, almost all of it would be gone. The question is, what happened? What could possibly cause the entire Bronze Age world to collapse so quickly and so completely? To answer that, we need to look at the cracks that were already appearing in the system, even at its height. It's 1250 BCE, and if you were paying very close attention, you might notice that something is starting to feel different across the eastern Mediterranean. The changes are subtle at first, the kind of thing that only becomes obvious in hindsight. But they're there, building, accumulating, creating stresses that the Bronze Age system isn't designed to handle. Let's start with something that won't be fully understood until modern climate scientists analyze tree rings, pollen samples, and marine sediment cores thousands of years from now. The climate is changing. Around 1300 BCE, a mega-drought begins to develop across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. This isn't a single catastrophic year of failed rains. This is a sustained shift in precipitation patterns that will last for 300 years. The evidence is written in nature's records. Tree rings from this period show narrower growth rings, indicating water stress. Pollen samples show shifts in vegetation, with drought-resistant species replacing those that need more moisture. The lake levels drop. Rivers that flowed reliably for centuries begin to fail during the dry season. Springs that sustained villages for generations run dry. But in 1250 BCE, no one sees the big picture. You're a farmer in the Hittite heartland of central Anatolia. Your grandfather talks about how the streams used to run stronger. Your father mentions that the crops don't seem as reliable as they were in his youth. But these are the kind of changes that unfold across generations, easy to dismiss as old people romanticizing the past. Except the grain yields really are dropping. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily. A field that used to produce enough to support 5 families now struggles to support 4. This means the palace can collect less surplus from the countryside, which means there's less to store against bad years, which means less flexibility when problems arise. And problems are arising. The Hittite archives from this period start showing something new, requests for grain from Egypt. These aren't small requests. One letter from the Hittite king to the pharaoh is almost desperate in tone. He needs grain, needs it urgently. His people are in need. He's asking his brother king, invoking their diplomatic relationship, to send shipments as quickly as possible. The pharaoh, to his credit, seems to have responded. Egyptian grain ships sailed north to Hittite ports. But think about what this means. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, the kingdom that fought Egypt to a standstill at Kadesh, can no longer reliably feed its own population. It's dependent on imports from hundreds of miles away. If anything disrupts those shipments, people starve. Similar stresses are building across the region. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces are responding to some perceived threat by massively upgrading their fortifications. At Mycenae, They extend the citadel walls to enclose an underground cistern, guaranteeing water supply during a siege. At Tiryns, they build galleries inside the thickness of the walls for storage and protection. These are expensive projects, requiring thousands of hours of labour, massive quantities of stone and significant planning. Why are they doing this? The archaeological record doesn't tell us explicitly. There are no tablets saying we're fortifying because of X. But the fortifications themselves are evidence of growing insecurity. Palace economies don't invest this kind of resource into military preparation unless they perceive a real threat. Some archaeologists think the Mycenaeans were worried about each other, that competition between the various Greek kingdoms was intensifying, possibly over control of trade routes or resources. Others think they were responding to external threats, raiders from outside the palace system. Still others point to evidence of internal unrest, suggestions that the dependent labourer populations might be growing restless under palace control. Whatever the cause, the fact of massive fortification projects tells us something important. The Mycenaean world no longer feels safe, and in a palace economy, anything that diverts resources to defence is taking those resources away from something else. Every worker building walls is a worker not producing textiles or farming or making bronze goods. Meanwhile, in Ugarit, the merchant city on the Syrian coast, the international correspondence starts showing strain. Letters complain about pirates in the sea lanes. Ships are being attacked, cargoes stolen. The scale seems to be increasing. This is more than the usual low-level piracy that's always existed. This is something that's starting to impact trade. And trade is everything. Remember, the entire Bronze Age economy depends on goods flowing across long distances. If ships can't sail safely, the copper from Cyprus doesn't reach the palaces. The tin from Afghanistan doesn't arrive. Bronze production stutters. Weapons can't be made in the quantities needed. Tools become scarce. The whole machine starts to break down. There's also evidence of increasing migration and displacement. Egyptian records from the reign of Pharaoh Meneptah, around 1213 to 1203 BCE, describe conflicts with Libyans approaching from the west. But these aren't just Libyan soldiers. The Egyptian accounts specifically mention that the Libyans are bringing their families with them, their women and children, their possessions. These aren't raiding expeditions, these are population movements. People looking for new lands because their old lands can no longer support them. The Egyptian texts also mention groups fighting alongside the Libyans with strange names: Ekwesh, Teresh, Luka, Shurdan, Shekelesh. These names will become more familiar and more ominous in Egyptian records over the next few decades. There are early mentions of what Egyptian scribes will eventually call the Sea Peoples, though that's a modern term. The Egyptians just listed the different groups by name. Who were these people? That's one of the great mysteries we'll explore later. But even in 1213 BCE, their presence in Egyptian records is significant. These are groups on the move, displaced from somewhere, looking for somewhere new. And they're numerous enough and organised enough to fight pitched battles against Egyptian armies. The Egyptians under Meneptah defeat them, or at least claim to. The king's mortuary temple includes inscriptions boasting of victory over the Libyan invasion, claiming to have killed thousands of enemies and captured their cattle and possessions. Whether the victory was as complete as claimed is debatable. Egyptian kings weren't known for modesty in their military records, but the important point is that Egypt is facing pressure from mobile groups of people who shouldn't be there according to the established international order. Now, around 1200 BCE, let's talk about Troy, the legendary city made famous by Homer's Iliad, though Homer won't compose that epic for another 400 years or so. Archaeological evidence shows that a city matching Homer's description, located at Hisarlik in northwestern Anatolia, was destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades. The lay archaeologist called Troy 7 shows clear signs of violent destruction. Did this destruction have anything to do with the wider Bronze Age collapse? Maybe. Troy was positioned at a crucial location controlling access to the Black Sea through the Dardanelles. Any ships sailing between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea had to pass Troy. That's a position of great strategic and economic importance. Control of that route could mean control of trade in grain from the Black Sea region, in metals, and whatever else was moving along those sea lanes. If Troy was destroyed as part of a conflict over control of trade routes, and if that conflict involved Mycenaean kingdoms as Homer's epics suggest, then the timing is suggestive. The Mycenaeans might have been trying to secure alternative trade routes as other routes were becoming unreliable, or they might have been fighting over dwindling resources, or the Trojan, War might have been completely unrelated to the wider collapse, just one of many conflicts that happened to occur during a period of general instability. The archaeological evidence can't tell us motives. It can only tell us that cities burned and weren't rebuilt, that trade patterns shifted, that the evidence of wealth and sophisticated material culture starts to decline in some areas. But here's where things get really interesting and really ominous. Around 1200 BCE, the palace at Pylos, that same palace whose tablet archives give us such detailed economic records, makes a series of unusual preparations. The tablets record the deployment of coast watchers, men sent to specific locations along the coast to watch for something. Watch for what? The tablets don't specify. Just that watchers are posted, that they are to be equipped with specific supplies, that they're organised in groups. The palace also seems to have been gathering its resources, pulling in bronze from outlying smithies, consolidating supplies, and at some point someone gathered all the tablets from various rooms and archives and placed them in baskets, possibly preparing to evacuate them. They never got the chance. The palace burned so hot that the wooden structural elements were incinerated. The clay tablets baked hard in the fire, and that's why they survived for us to read 3,000 years later. What was Pylos watching for? Raiders from the sea? An army from a rival kingdom? Internal revolt? We don't know. But the coast watchers suggest a threat expected from the sea, and whatever the threat was, the precautions didn't work. Pylos burned, probably around 1180 BCE or shortly thereafter. The palace was destroyed completely. It was never rebuilt. The Linear B script disappeared from the Greek world and wouldn't return for 400 years, and Pylos wasn't alone. Across Greece, citadels are burning, not all at once, but in a cascade over several decades around 1200 to 1150 BCE. Mycenae burns, Tiryns burns, Thebes burns. Some are rebuilt, then burn again, some are simply abandoned. The population crashes. Archaeological surveys show that the number of inhabited sites in Greece drops by about 75% between 1200 and 1100 BCE. 3 out of every 4 communities just vanish. Where did the people go? Some probably died in the violence. Some likely died in the famines that probably accompanied the collapse of the palace redistribution system. Some migrated to regions that seemed safer, perhaps to islands or coastal areas, where they could support themselves through fishing and small-scale farming without depending on palace infrastructure. The trade networks are failing too. Shipwrecks from around 1200 BCE tell stories of desperate final voyages. The most famous is the Uluburun shipwreck, found off the coast of southern Turkey. The ship went down around 1300 BCE, just before the collapse really accelerated, but its cargo shows the Bronze Age trade network at its peak. 10 tons of copper ingots, 1 ton of tin ingots, glass ingots from Egypt, ebony from Africa, ivory from elephants and hippos, gold, jewellery, tools, weapons, pottery from multiple kingdoms. It's a floating museum of Bronze Age interconnection. But after 1200 BCE, these kinds of rich international cargoes become much rarer in the archaeological record. The ships are still sailing, but they're carrying less, travelling shorter distances, taking fewer risks. The system that moved tin from Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus, and gold from Egypt and amber from the Baltic, that system is breaking down. In Ugarit, the final days are recorded in the archives with an eerie sense of doom. Letters sent to Cyprus become increasingly desperate. One message says the enemy ships have been sighted. Another says the city is burning, all the troops have been sent away, the city is defenceless. Help us. The final letter was never sent. It was found in the ruins of the palace, still sitting in the archive room when the building burned. Ugarit was destroyed around 1185 to 1180 BCE. The destruction was total. The city burned completely. It was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned. 3,000 years of continuous occupation ended in a single catastrophe. Modern excavations have found bodies in the ruins, people who didn't escape. The destruction was violent and thorough, and here's the thing that should make your skin crawl a little. The people of Ugarit saw it coming. Their letters show they knew they were in danger. They asked for help. Help didn't arrive in time or didn't arrive at all, or arrived but wasn't enough. And then they were gone. The Hittite Empire is collapsing too. The capital, Hattusa, is abandoned around 1200 BCE. Whether it was destroyed by enemies or abandoned by its inhabitants is still debated. The archaeological evidence shows some burning, but also signs of deliberate abandonment, as if people packed up valuables and left in an organized way. Either way, the city that had been the center of one of the great powers of the age was suddenly empty. The entire Hittite administrative structure vanished. The empire had controlled Anatolia and northern Syria for centuries. It had a sophisticated bureaucracy, a powerful military, extensive trade networks, and suddenly it's just gone. Successor states will eventually emerge in some Hittite territories, but they're smaller, poorer, less organized. The empire itself is finished. So by 1180 BCE, let's take stock. The Mycenaean palaces in Greece are destroyed or abandoned. The Hittite Empire has vanished. Ugarit is ash. Cyprus is being raided and partially depopulated. The trade networks that connected the Bronze Age world are severed. The flow of tin has stopped. Bronze production is crashing. The palace economies that organized everything are gone. But Egypt is still standing. Battered, but standing. And Egypt's records give us our most detailed account of what happened next, of the force that many historians blame for the entire collapse, the Sea Peoples. It's 1177 BCE, and Egypt is facing the fight of its life. Pharaoh Ramesses III is in his 5th year of rule, and he's about to confront an invasion unlike anything in Egyptian memory. Not just an army, but multiple peoples, moving together, coming by land and sea, bringing their families, their possessions, their entire lives with them. This isn't a raid, this is a migration, and they're coming for Egypt. Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu contains the most detailed account we have. The walls are covered with carved reliefs showing battles by land and sea, and with hieroglyphic inscriptions describing what happened. The pharaoh's scribes recorded the names of the enemy groups: Peleset, Sheka, Shekelesh, Denian, Weshesh. Some of these names are familiar from earlier Egyptian records, others are new. Together they're the coalition the pharaoh has to stop. The inscriptions describe a path of destruction through the Near East. The Hittite lands are mentioned as overrun. Carchemish, an important city in northern Syria, is cut off. Cyprus is devastated. The coast of the Levant is burning, and now they're at Egypt's doorstep, coming through the Sinai, assembling on the coast for a combined land and sea assault. Picture the scene. You're an Egyptian soldier on the Nile Delta, and you can see the enemy fleet approaching. Dozens of ships, maybe hundreds. They're not Egyptian designs, not the standard ships you're used to seeing. These have different hull shapes, different sail configurations. They're loaded with warriors, men armed with round shields and long swords and spears. Some wear distinctive feathered headdresses, others have different armor styles. And on land, the enemy host is enormous. Men, women, children, all moving together. They have ox carts loaded with possessions, families travelling with warriors. This isn't an army that's planning to return home. These people are looking for a new home, and if they can take Egypt, they'll have the richest land in the world. Ramesses III meets them in battle. The land battle happens somewhere in the Sinai or the Eastern Delta. The Egyptian records claim overwhelming victory, thousands of enemies killed, prisoners taken. The reliefs show Egyptian chariots crushing infantry, archers cutting down the invaders, bound captives being led away. But the sea battle is the one that gets the most attention in the temple reliefs. The Egyptian ships engage the Sea People's fleet in what might be the first naval battle ever depicted in such detail. The Egyptian vessels equipped with archers sail up to the enemy ships and pour arrows into them at close range. Soldiers use grappling hooks to pull enemy ships close and board them. Enemy warriors fall into the water, ships capsize. The Nile turns red. The inscriptions claim total victory. The northern peoples, the Sea Peoples, are defeated. Egypt is saved. The pharaoh, beloved of the gods, mighty in battle, has protected his kingdom. It's exactly the kind of thing Egyptian kings always claim in their mortuary temples. But here's the question historians still argue about. How complete was the victory, really? Egypt survived, so in that sense, yes, Ramesses III succeeded, where the Hittites and the Mycenaeans failed. The kingdom continued. The pharaonic system kept functioning. But Egypt was changed. The costs of the war must have been enormous. The economy was strained. The military had taken losses, and some of the Sea Peoples didn't leave. The Peleset, probably the same group as the biblical Philistines, settled on the southern Levantine coast, in what's now Gaza and southern Israel. The Egyptians apparently allowed this, or couldn't prevent it. The Cheka settled further north along the coast. so the Sea Peoples weren't entirely defeated. Some of them found new homes, just not in Egypt proper, and Egypt's power was diminished. The empire never recovered its former strength. Within a few generations, Egypt would fracture into competing kingdoms during the Third Intermediate Period, its time as a major power temporarily over. But who were these Sea Peoples? That question haunts archaeology, because the Egyptian records don't really explain. They name the groups, describe their fighting methods, show their distinctive appearances in relief carvings, but don't say where they came from or why they were moving. Some of the names offer clues. The Peliset are almost certainly the Philistines. Their name, their settlement area, and their material culture all match. Archaeological excavations of Philistine sites show pottery styles and architectural features that have connections to the Aegean world, to Mycenaean Greece, or Cyprus, or Crete. This suggests that at least some of them came from that direction. The Shekelesh might be connected to Sicily. The Sherden, mentioned in earlier records, might be connected to Sardinia. The Danaian might be the Danaoi, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. But these are tentative connections, linguistic similarities that might or might not represent real historical movements. The bigger question is why they were moving at all. The traditional narrative, the one that dominated for much of the 20th century, treated them as invaders, warrior peoples who destroyed the Bronze Age civilizations and brought on the Dark Age, raiders and pirates who burned cities for plunder. But that narrative has problems. If they were just raiders, why bring your families? Why bring ox carts loaded with household possessions? Raiders travel light, strike fast, and leave. These people were migrating. They were looking for new lands to settle, which means they were leaving somewhere, fleeing something. What were they fleeing? Maybe the same climate problems affecting the Eastern Mediterranean. Maybe the collapse of the palace economies in their homelands, which left them without the structures that had supported their communities for generations. Maybe famine. Maybe warfare. Probably all of the above in different combinations for different groups. Here's a theory that's gained traction in recent years. The Sea Peoples weren't the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were the result of it. They were refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean world, from failing Anatolian kingdoms, from Cyprus as its copper trade collapsed, from Crete as its economy withered. The palace systems that had organized society for centuries were falling apart. The people who depended on those systems had two choices: stay and starve, or move and hope to find something better. They moved. Some tried to fight their way into Egypt, the one major kingdom that still seemed to be functioning. They failed. But some found new homes on the Levantine coast. Some probably scattered to other areas and disappeared into the historical record. Some probably died during the migrations. And while they moved, while they fought, while they desperately sought new lands, they contributed to the very collapse that had displaced them. Not because they were destroyers by nature, but because when thousands of armed people move through your territory, looking for food and land, conflict is inevitable. Cities that were already stressed, already dealing with drought and trade disruptions and political instability, couldn't withstand the additional pressure. They fell. Let's go back to Ugarit for a moment. Remember those final letters? The desperate calls for help as enemy ships approached? Recent analysis suggests something interesting. The ships might not have been invading Ugarit specifically. They might have been raiding along the coast, attacking ships, disrupting trade. Ugarit, dependent on maritime commerce for its wealth, was fatally vulnerable to this. The city's food supply came partly from imports. Its economy depended on the safe movement of goods. When the sea lanes became too dangerous, when ships stopped sailing, the city's economic model collapsed. The physical destruction might have been almost secondary to the economic strangulation. This pattern probably repeated across the Bronze Age world. It wasn't that armies marched through and destroyed everything in a single campaign, it was that the systems broke down. Trade routes failed, food stopped moving from surplus regions to deficit regions, bronze stopped flowing to the smithies. The palace redistribution systems couldn't function without the resources they depended on. Without the palace systems, the dependent workers had no way to feed themselves. Social order collapsed. In the chaos, cities burned, either from warfare or from internal breakdown. And once the collapse started, it cascaded. The interconnection that had been the Bronze Age world's strength became its fatal weakness. When the Hittite Empire fell, the kingdoms that depended on trade with the Hittites were stressed. When the Mycenaean palaces burned, the Eastern Mediterranean lost a major trading partner. When the copper from Cyprus became unreliable, everyone's bronze production suffered. When the tin routes from Afghanistan were cut, the entire Bronze Age technological base was threatened. It's a systems collapse, the whole being much more than the sum of its parts. Individual kingdoms might have weathered individual crises, but all the crises hit at once or in rapid succession, and the system couldn't absorb that many shocks. The brittleness that had been built into the palace economies, the total dependence on centralized control and long-distance trade turned out to be fatal. By 1150 BCE, the collapse is essentially complete across the eastern Mediterranean. The great palaces are ruins or abandoned. The international diplomatic system is gone. The trade networks that moved goods across thousands of miles are severed. Literacy has disappeared from Greece and won't return for 400 years. The population in many areas has crashed by 50 to 75%. The Bronze Age world is over. But let's be clear about something. The collapse wasn't total everywhere. Egypt survived, diminished but intact. Assyria in northern Mesopotamia actually emerged from the collapse period stronger, expanding into territories left vacant by the fall of the Hittites and Mitanni. Phoenician cities on the Lebanese coast adapted and eventually thrived. Some areas maintained continuity, while others experienced complete breakdown. And even in the worst affected areas, people survived. They had to completely reorganize their societies, abandon the palace systems, revert to simpler forms of social organization, but they survived. Which brings us to one of the most important questions about the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just what destroyed the old system, it was what did they do after? How did people rebuild? What kind of world emerged from the ashes of the Bronze Age? To answer that, we need to explore what historians call the Dark Age, the centuries between the collapse and the emergence of classical civilization. And we need to understand that dark doesn't mean empty. It means we know less because writing disappeared and monumental architecture stopped. But people were still there, still living, still adapting, still slowly building the foundations of what would come next. So what really happened? We've seen the collapse unfold, watched cities burn and kingdoms fall and trade networks shatter. We've met the sea peoples and explored the climate problems and witnessed the cascade of failure across the Bronze Age world. But can we actually explain it? Can we point to one cause and say this is why it all fell apart? The honest answer is no. And that frustrates historians and archaeologists because we like clear explanations. We want to be able to say the Bronze Age collapsed because of X, but reality is more complex than that. The collapse seems to have been what systems theorists call a perfect storm, multiple independent failures occurring simultaneously or in rapid sequence, creating a cascade that overwhelmed the system's ability to adapt. Let's examine the major theories one by one, because understanding what probably didn't happen is as important as understanding what probably did. Theory 1. Climate change. We know from multiple independent lines of evidence that a major drought affected the eastern Mediterranean and Near East starting around 1300 BCE and lasting until at least 1000 BCE. This is solid science. Tree ring data from ancient junipers in Turkey shows narrow rings indicating water stress. Pollen cores from lakes show shifts in vegetation from more water-intensive plants to drought-resistant species. Marine sediment cores show changes in runoff patterns. This was a real, sustained climate event. The megadrought would have stressed agricultural production everywhere. Remember, Bronze Age kingdoms depended on agricultural surplus to support their palace economies. Their specialists, their military, their building projects. Reduce the surplus and the entire system is stressed. Multiple bad harvest years could deplete stored reserves. A decades-long drought could push the system to the breaking point. And we have documentary evidence. Those Hittite letters requesting grain from Egypt. Egyptian records of conflicts with Libyans, who were apparently being pushed out of their territories by failing resources. The logic is sound. If people can't feed themselves where they are, they move. Mass migrations create conflicts. Conflicts disrupt trade and diplomatic relationships. The cascade begins. But here's the problem with a purely climate-based explanation. Droughts had happened before. The Bronze Age world had survived previous climate fluctuations, and the drought affected different regions differently. Some areas suffered more than others. If climate change alone caused the collapse, we'd expect to see it most severe in the areas most affected by drought. But the collapse was most severe in the palace economies of Greece and Anatolia, while places like Egypt and Mesopotamia also affected by the drought, survived. So climate change was probably necessary but not sufficient. It stressed the system, but something else pushed it over the edge. Theory 2. Earthquakes. This is sometimes called the earthquake storm hypothesis. The idea is that a series of major earthquakes struck the eastern Mediterranean in rapid succession around 1200 BCE, destroying cities and disrupting societies. There's actually archaeological evidence for this. Multiple sites from this period show destruction layers that include collapsed walls and buildings consistent with seismic damage, not just fire damage from warfare. Some researchers have identified what they call an earthquake fault zone running through the eastern Mediterranean that might have been particularly active during this period. If major quakes hit multiple cities in a short span, the destruction could have overwhelmed the ability of Bronze Age societies to rebuild. And earthquakes don't just destroy buildings, they disrupt water systems, damage agricultural infrastructure, trigger landslides and tsunamis. A major quake could render a coastal city uninhabitable. A series of major quakes could create a disaster beyond the Bronze Age world's capacity to respond to. But again, there are problems with making this the sole explanation. Earthquakes are relatively localized. Even a magnitude 7 or 8 quake affects a region, not an entire civilization spanning thousands of miles, and many of the destroyed cities show clear evidence of warfare, burning and violence, not just structural collapse. Weapons are found in the destruction layers. Bodies show signs of violent death. These weren't just earthquake victims, so earthquakes might have been a contributing factor, possibly the triggering event in some locations, but probably not the whole story. Theory 3. Invasions, specifically the Sea Peoples. This is the traditional explanation, the one that dominated for much of the 20th century. Warrior peoples attacked and destroyed the Bronze Age civilizations. The Egyptian records seem to support this. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show battles. The inscriptions describe enemies attacking. Cities burned. Clearly, the Sea Peoples did it. But as we've discussed, this explanation has serious weaknesses. The Sea Peoples themselves seem to have been refugees, displaced by the collapse rather than its cause. They attacked Egypt after the collapse was already well underway, and they settled in some areas, which isn't what you'd expect from pure raiders. Raiders take plunder and leave. These people stayed. Moreover, the Sea Peoples couldn't possibly have destroyed all the affected areas. They're documented mainly in Egyptian records fighting in the eastern Mediterranean. How did they get to Greece to burn the Mycenaean palaces? How did they reach the Hittite heartland in central Anatolia? The timeline and geography don't work for a simple invasion hypothesis. Modern archaeology has largely moved away from blaming the Sea Peoples for causing the collapse. They were part of the story, certainly. Their movements and conflicts contributed to the chaos, but they were more symptom than cause. Theory 4. Systems collapse. This is the explanation that's gained the most traction in recent years. It's based on complexity theory, the study of how complex systems behave. The Bronze Age palace economies were highly complex systems with many interconnected parts. The palaces controlled production and distribution. Trade networks moved essential resources across thousands of miles. Diplomatic relationships maintained peace between great powers. Specialists provided services. Dependent labourers produced goods. Everything was connected to everything else. Complex systems are efficient, but they're also fragile. They have limited redundancy. When one part fails, the failure can cascade through the system. And the Bronze Age system had multiple single points of failure. The tin supply depended on trade routes from Afghanistan or Britain. Break those routes and bronze production stops everywhere. The palace redistribution systems depended on agricultural surplus. Reduce the surplus through drought, and the whole palace economy is threatened. Systems collapse theory suggests that the Bronze Age world had become too complex, too specialized, too dependent on everything working perfectly. When multiple stresses hit simultaneously, drought, earthquakes, migrations, conflicts, the system couldn't adapt. It was too rigid, too centralized. Instead of gracefully degrading, it collapsed catastrophically. This explains several puzzling features of the collapse: why it was so rapid, cascading failures accelerate; why it was so complete in some areas, systems either work or they don't, there's not much middle ground in a highly centralized economy; why some areas survived and others didn't. It depended on how integrated you were into the Bronze Age system. Egypt survived because it was never as dependent on long-distance trade, as the Mycenaean or Hittite kingdoms. The Nile provided reliable water and transportation. Egypt could be relatively self-sufficient. When the international system collapsed, Egypt was hurt but not destroyed. The Phoenician cities survived and adapted by decentralizing. Instead of palace-controlled economies, they developed merchant-based systems with more flexibility and redundancy. When one trade route failed, merchants found others. When one city was destroyed, others continued operating. But the Mycenaean palaces and the Hittite Empire were totally integrated into the international system. They depended on it. When it collapsed, they collapsed with it. Theory 5. Internal revolt. This is a less popular theory, but worth considering. What if the collapse was partly driven by the people at the bottom of the Bronze Age social hierarchy? The dependent labourers, the workers who received rations from the palace, but had no real autonomy or ownership of their production. Some archaeological evidence hints at this. At Pylos, before the palace burned, someone carefully removed bronze items from the archives and workshops. This wasn't the random looting you'd expect from raiders. It was selective. Someone who knew what was valuable and where it was kept. Possibly palace officials preparing to flee. Possibly workers taking what they could before the system fell apart. At other sites, the destruction seems to have included deliberate targeting of palace administrative areas. Archives were burned, storage facilities were emptied. This could be warfare, certainly. But it could also be revolution, people who'd lived under palace control, for generations finally having enough. The theory goes that as the palace system became stressed by drought, earthquakes and trade disruptions, they demanded more from the dependent workers while being able to provide less. Rations got smaller, work demands got harder. At some point, the workers might have decided they'd be better off without the palace. They burned it down and went back to subsistence farming. There's not enough evidence to prove this happened, but it's plausible. And it might explain the thoroughness of the destruction in some places. External invaders might burn a palace, but they'd probably loot the storerooms first. Internal revolutionaries might just want to destroy the symbols of their oppression. So which theory is right? Probably all of them, to varying degrees in different places. The collapse likely had multiple causes working together. Climate change stressed agricultural production. Earthquakes destroyed some cities and damaged infrastructure. Trade disruptions cut off essential resources like tin. The systems became fragile. Population movements, whether refugees or raiders, added additional pressure. Some internal revolts might have occurred in places where palace control was particularly oppressive, and the interconnection of the Bronze Age world meant that failures in one region cascaded to others. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was a convergence of catastrophes, a perfect storm that the Bronze Age system, for all its sophistication, couldn't weather. But here's what's really important to understand. The collapse wasn't the end of human civilization in the region. It was the end of one way of organizing civilization. The palace economies were gone, the international system was gone, the bronze-based technological complex was gone, but people remained. Communities survived. Knowledge was preserved, at least partially. And slowly, painfully, across centuries, new forms of civilization emerged from the ruins. These new forms would be different, more decentralized, more flexible. Based on iron instead of bronze, making metal more democratically available. Using alphabetic writing instead of complex syllabic scripts, making literacy more accessible. Organized around city-states instead of territorial kingdoms, allowing for more political diversity and experimentation. The classical world that we think of when we imagine ancient Greece and Rome, that world was built on the ruins of the Bronze Age collapse. It couldn't have emerged without the collapse clearing away the old structures. Sometimes, systems have to fall apart before something new can grow. That's the pattern we see again and again in history. Collapse, Dark Age, rebirth, each cycle building on what came before while creating something genuinely new. The Bronze Age collapse was catastrophic for the people living through it. Civilizations fell, cities burned, people starved, knowledge was lost. But it wasn't the end. It was a transformation. Painful, destructive, but ultimately leading to new forms of human organization that would shape the world for millennia to come. It's 1100 BCE, and if you'd been able to see the Greek world from above, you'd be struck by how empty it looks. Where there were once palaces and towns and hundreds of small villages, now there's mostly silence. The great citadels sit abandoned. Mycenae's massive walls still stand, but no one lives inside them. the palace at Pylos is a charred ruin, already becoming overgrown. The roads that connected the kingdoms are still there, but no one travels them carrying palace tribute or trade goods. The whole infrastructure of Bronze Age civilization has simply vanished. This is what historians call the Greek Dark Age, and the name fits. It was dark in the sense that we know less about it. Without palace archives and Linear B tablets, our written record goes blank. The Greeks themselves will later have only the vaguest memories of this period, preserved in oral traditions that will eventually become Homer's epics, stories about heroes and gods that contained fragments of Bronze Age reality mixed with centuries of elaboration. But dark also fits in another sense. The material culture, the physical evidence of daily life becomes simpler, poorer, less sophisticated. The population crashes, the technology regresses. In many measurable ways, this is a step backward from the achievements of the Bronze Age. Let's get specific about what life looked like in Greece during this period, because understanding the Dark Age is crucial to understanding what came after. You're part of a small farming community, maybe 30 or 40 people, living somewhere in what used to be Mycenaean territory. Your community isn't attached to a palace because there are no more palaces. You're not receiving rations because there's no centralized redistribution system. You're subsisting on what you can grow, gather, and hunt in your immediate territory. Your house is simple. One room, maybe two if your family's doing well, stone foundations, mud brick walls, thatched roof, a central hearth for cooking and heat, basic pottery for storage, cooking, and serving. But this pottery is different from what your great-grandparents would have used. It's handmade, not wheel-thrown. The decoration is geometric, simple patterns of lines and shapes, nothing like the elaborate naturalistic designs of Mycenaean pottery with their octopi and flowers and complex scenes. You have no access to bronze. The trade networks that brought tin from Afghanistan are gone. The palace workshops that employed bronze smiths are gone. The redistributive system that allocated bronze to workers is gone. For a while, people probably scavenged bronze from the ruins, melting down old tools and weapons to make new ones. But bronze objects become increasingly rare and precious. Instead, you're learning to work with iron. Iron is actually harder to work than bronze. It requires higher temperatures to smelt and forge. But iron ore is common, found in many regions. You don't need long-distance trade to get it. If you can figure out how to work it, and people are figuring this out through trial and error across the Dark Age, you can be self-sufficient in metal tools. The iron technology spread slowly through the 11th and 10th centuries BCE. Early iron objects are often crude, the metalworking technique still being developed. But gradually, smiths learned to carburize iron, adding carbon to create steel, which is even harder than bronze. They learned to forge weapons and tools that hold an edge better than anything the Bronze Age produced. This is the democratization of metal technology. In the Bronze Age, bronze was controlled by palaces and their workshops. Specialized smiths worked with palace-supplied materials. Common people had limited access. But in the Iron Age, any community with a smith and access to iron ore can make tools. This levels the playing field in a way that will have profound political implications later. But in 1100 BCE, that's still in the future. Right now, you're just trying to survive. Your community farms small plots, growing barley mostly, some wheat if the soil is good enough. You keep a few animals, sheep, goats, maybe a pig or two. You hunt when possible, deer or boar or birds. You gather wild foods, plants, nuts, whatever the season provides. There's no writing in your world. The Linear B script died with the palaces. The scribes who knew it are long gone. You preserve knowledge through oral tradition, stories and songs passed down from elders to children. You remember dimly that there were once great kings and magnificent palaces. These memories will survive, distorted and elaborated, until they become the myths of a heroic age. Your community is largely isolated. You might have contact with a few neighbouring settlements, maybe engage in limited trade of goods, a day's walk away. But long-distance travel is rare and dangerous. There's no larger political structure protecting you, no palace guards maintaining order, no international diplomatic system preventing conflicts. If raiders come, your community has to defend itself or flee. Population in Greece during this period drops catastrophically. Estimates suggest that by 1100 BCE, the population was perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of what it had been in the 13th century BCE. Part of this is deaths during the collapse, from violence, famine, disease. Part is emigration, people leaving for regions that seem safer or more stable. Part is reduced birth rates, as poverty and instability make it harder to raise children. The number of inhabited sites tells the story. Archaeological surveys in different regions of Greece show similar patterns. In Messenia, the region where Pylos stood, there were about 150 inhabited sites in the 13th century BCE. By 1100 BCE, there were 14. In the Argolid, the region around Mycenae and Tiryns, the collapse is similarly dramatic. Dozens of communities just vanish from the archaeological record. The survivors cluster in defensible locations, often on hilltops or near the coast, where they can escape by sea if necessary. They build simple fortifications, nothing like the massive Cyclopean walls of the Bronze Age, but enough to deter small-scale raiders. They focus on survival, not growth or expansion. Trade collapses to local exchange only. The pottery evidence shows this clearly. In the Bronze Age, Mycenaean pottery spread across the Mediterranean, found in sites from Spain to Egypt. After the collapse, pottery styles become intensely local. Each region, sometimes each settlement, has its own style. There's no long-distance movement of goods. Communities are making what they need from local materials. But this isolation and poverty aren't universal across the Mediterranean. The collapse affects different regions very differently. Let's look at what's happening elsewhere during the same period because the contrast is important. In Cyprus, the collapse hits hard, but not as catastrophically as in Greece. Many cities are destroyed or damaged. The copper trade that made Cyprus wealthy is disrupted. Population drops. But the island doesn't depopulate completely. Some cities, like Enkomi and Kition, survive or are rebuilt. Refugees from the mainland, possibly including some of the sea peoples, settle on Cyprus and blend with the existing population. The pottery from this period shows a mix of styles, local Cypriot traditions mixing with influences from Mycenaean refugees. Cyprus maintains some maritime contact with the Levant and Egypt. The old trade networks are broken, but local cabotage, small ships sailing from port to port along the coast, continues. This keeps Cyprus connected in ways that Greece isn't. And critically, Cyprus maintains literacy. Not Linear B, which was specific to the Greek palaces, but other writing systems continue in use for administrative and economic purposes. On the Levantine coast in what's now Lebanon and northern Israel, cities like Byblos, Sidon and Tyre experience disruption but survive. These are the Phoenician cities, though they won't be called that for centuries yet. They're part of the Bronze Age trade network but not as dependent on palace economies. When the palaces fall, the Phoenician cities adapt. They shift from palace-controlled trade to merchant-based systems. Individual merchants and their families build trading networks. They develop relationships with partners in other ports. They take risks, investing in cargoes and voyages. When one route becomes dangerous, they find another. This flexibility, this decentralization, allows them to survive and eventually thrive. By the 10th century BCE, Phoenician merchants are rebuilding Mediterranean trade networks. They're not the centralized palace-to-palace exchanges of the Bronze Age. They're merchant ventures, ships carrying mixed cargoes of whatever can be sold profitably. Phoenician pottery, glass, metalwork, and purple-dyed textiles start appearing across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians are filling the vacuum left by the collapse of Bronze Age trade. In Egypt, the picture is complex. Ramesses. 3 successfully defended against the Sea Peoples, but the costs were enormous. The Egyptian military and economy were strained. The empire in Syria-Palestine, which Egypt had controlled or influenced during the New Kingdom, is lost. Settlers from the Sea Peoples, particularly the Peliset who become the Philistines, occupy the southern coast. Egyptian power contracts back toward the Nile Valley. And within a few generations after Ramesses III, Egypt fragments. The New Kingdom ends. The third intermediate period begins, with Egypt split between competing dynasties, pharaohs in the north and south both claiming legitimacy. Egypt is no longer a great power capable of projecting force across the Near East. It's focused on internal struggles and survival. But crucially, Egyptian civilization continues. The temples keep functioning. The priesthoods maintain their knowledge and practices. Hieroglyphic writing continues without interruption. The agricultural system based on the Nile's annual floods keeps producing food. Egypt is diminished but not destroyed. In Mesopotamia, Assyria actually emerges from the collapse period stronger. The Assyrian kingdom in northern Iraq had been a secondary power during the Bronze Age, overshadowed by the Hittites to the west and Babylonians to the south. But as the Hittite Empire collapsed and Babylonia weakened, Assyria expanded into the vacuum. By the 10th century BCE, Assyrian kings are campaigning into former Hittite territories in Syria and Anatolia. They're rebuilding trade networks, now organised around Assyrian merchants and caravans rather than palace-to-palace exchanges. They're developing military innovations, including the systematic use of iron weapons and cavalry, that will make Assyria the dominant power in the Near East for the next several centuries. So the Dark Age isn't uniform. Greece suffers catastrophically, losing population, literacy, and material culture. But Cyprus maintains some continuity. The Phoenician cities adapt and survive. Egypt is diminished but not destroyed. Assyria actually strengthens. The Bronze Age collapse reshuffles the deck, destroying some powers and allowing others to rise. Back in Greece, life during the Dark Age is hard but not without its own logic and even advantages. Without palace controls, people have more autonomy. If you're a farmer in 1100 BCE Greece, you're poor, but you're not a dependent labourer receiving rations. You own your production, such as it is. You make your own decisions about what to plant, when to plant it, what to do with the harvest. This is a kind of freedom that didn't exist under palace rule. Communities are more egalitarian. Without palace bureaucracies and social hierarchies, the gap between richest and poorest narrows. Everyone is poor by Bronze Age standards, but no one is enormously wealthy either. Leadership is based on personal qualities, strength, wisdom, speaking ability, not on inherited status or palace appointments. This is a return to something like the band societies of the deep past, but with Bronze Age knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and other technologies preserved. And knowledge is being preserved, even without writing. The oral traditions are incredibly sophisticated. Trained singers, what the Greeks will later call oidos, memorize vast amounts of poetry. They learn genealogies of important families, stories about the old days when there were kings and heroes, religious hymns, practical knowledge about agriculture and navigation and crafts. This oral tradition will eventually produce Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, epics that preserve genuine Bronze Age details mixed with Dark Age elaborations. Some technologies actually develop during the Dark Age. Ironworking spreads and improves. Pottery styles evolve, becoming more sophisticated in their geometric decorations. Shipbuilding continues, with communities maintaining maritime skills even though long-distance trade has collapsed. These are seeds that will eventually grow into the classical Greek achievements. By 1000 BCE, about 150 years into the Dark Age, things are beginning to stabilize. The population has stopped falling. Communities have adjusted to the new reality. The iron technology is becoming more widespread and sophisticated. Some limited trade is resuming, local networks at first, but slowly extending further. And something else is happening. In the oral traditions, in the communal decision-making of these small Dark Age communities, in the emerging patterns of trade and interaction, the foundations are being laid for something completely new. Not a restoration of the Bronze Age palace systems. Nobody wants that back. But a different model of political organisation, based on citizen communities rather than king-centred states. The idea of the polis, the city-state, is beginning to germinate. But that's still centuries in the future. In 1000 BCE, Greece is still dark, still poor, still isolated. The people living through this period have no idea that their descendants will create democracy, philosophy, drama, the achievements that will define classical civilization. They're just trying to survive, to maintain their traditions, to pass something down to their children. They're living in the ruins of a lost world, not yet able to imagine the new world they're building. Not everywhere collapsed. That's the crucial point to understand about the Bronze Age collapse. While Greece descended into poverty and isolation, while the Hittite Empire vanished, while Mycenaean palaces burned, other regions survived, adapted, or even thrived. Understanding who made it, through, and how they did it tells us as much about the collapse as understanding who fell. Let's start with Egypt again, because Egypt's survival is one of the most important facts about the collapse period. After Rameses III defeated the Sea Peoples around 1177 BCE, Egypt had breathing room. The kingdom had survived its greatest test. But survival came at a price. The military campaigns had been expensive. The royal treasury was depleted. The army had taken casualties that needed to be replaced. The international trade system that had enriched Egypt was shattered. Syrian territories that had provided tribute and resources were lost or in chaos. The flow of luxury goods from the Aegean and Anatolia had stopped. Within a few decades of Ramesses III's death, Egypt began fragmenting. The new kingdom, which had made Egypt the most powerful state in the Near East for centuries, was ending. Power shifted away from the pharaoh toward two competing centres, the priests of Amun at Thebes in the south and the royal court in the north. By 1069 BCE, Egypt was effectively split, with different dynasties controlling different regions. This is the Third Intermediate Period, and by Bronze Age standards it represents a significant decline. Egypt was no longer capable of projecting power into Syria-Palestine. It was no longer the diplomatic equal of great kingdoms because there were no other great kingdoms to be equal to. The international system was gone, and Egypt had to adjust to a new reality. But here's what's remarkable. Egyptian civilization continued largely uninterrupted. The temples kept functioning. The priests maintained their elaborate rituals. Hieroglyphic writing continued in use without a break. The scribal schools kept training new generations in the sacred script. The artistic traditions were preserved. The agricultural cycle based on the Nile's floods continued as it had for thousands of years. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse because it had geographic advantages and was less dependent on the international system than the Mycenaean or Hittite kingdoms. The Nile provided reliable transportation and irrigation. The desert on both sides offered natural protection. Egypt could be largely self-sufficient in food and basic resources. When the trade networks collapsed, Egypt was hurt but not destroyed. The contrast with Greece is stark. Greece depended on the palace system and its trade networks. When those collapsed, Greek society had to be completely reorganized from the ground up. Egypt's core institutions, temple, priesthood, agricultural system, survived and provided continuity through the crisis. Now let's move to the Phoenician cities on the Lebanese coast because their story is different from both Egypt and Greece. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, Byblos and Arwad had been part of the Bronze Age trade network, trading with Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus and the Aegean. When that system collapsed, they could have been destroyed like so many other cities. Instead, they adapted. The key was decentralization. The Phoenician cities weren't organized as palace economies. They had kings, but power was shared among wealthy merchant families. When the old trade routes failed, these merchants didn't wait for royal direction. They went looking for new routes, new markets, new opportunities. By the 10th century BCE, Phoenician ships were exploring the entire Mediterranean. They established trading posts and eventually colonies across the sea lanes. They traded metal, especially silver and tin, from mines in Spain. They traded their famous purple-dyed textiles, produced from murex shells. They traded glass, metalwork and ivory carved by Phoenician artisans. And they spread an innovation that would change history forever: the alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet was simpler than any writing system that had come before. Instead of hundreds or thousands of symbols like cuneiform or hieroglyphics, it had just 22 characters, each representing a single sound. You could learn to read and write in weeks rather than years of training. This democratized literacy. You didn't need to be a palace scribe trained from childhood. Any merchant could learn the alphabet and keep his own records. Any trader could write letters. The alphabet spread everywhere Phoenician merchants went. The Greeks would adopt it and modify it around 800 BCE, adding vowels to create the Greek alphabet. From there it would spread to the Romans and eventually to most of the world. The Phoenicians turned the collapse of the Bronze Age system into an opportunity. They weren't constrained by palace control or the old diplomatic protocols. They were free to innovate, to take risks, to build a new kind of Mediterranean economy based on merchant networks rather than palace-to-palace exchanges. Cyprus tells another survival story. The island was devastated during the collapse. Cities burned. The copper trade that had made Cyprus wealthy was disrupted. Population dropped significantly. But Cyprus didn't empty completely. Some cities, including Enkomi and Kition, survived or were rebuilt. Refugees from the Aegean, perhaps including Mycenaean Greeks fleeing the collapse of their palaces, settled on Cyprus and mixed with the existing population. The archaeological record shows this mixing. Late Bronze Age Cypriot pottery traditions blend with Mycenaean styles. Architecture shows influences from both traditions. Languages mixed. with different populations maintaining their own dialects while living in proximity. Cyprus became a melting pot, refugees and survivors creating hybrid communities, and critically, Cyprus maintained its copper production. The mines kept operating, though on a smaller scale than during the Bronze Age peak. Local smiths worked the copper, producing tools, weapons, and vessels. As trade networks slowly rebuilt during the Dark Age, Cyprus was positioned to participate. Phoenician merchants came to Cyprus for copper. Greek traders, once the Greek world began recovering, returned to the island. Cyprus was a bridge between east and west. In Anatolia, the former heartland of the Hittite Empire, the collapse was severe but not total. The empire itself vanished. The capital Hattusa was abandoned. The bureaucracy dissolved. The cuneiform archives went silent. But people remained in the Anatolian plateau. They organized into smaller kingdoms and principalities, often centered on fortified hilltop sites. These Neo-Hittite states, as archaeologists call them, preserved some Hittite cultural traditions while adapting to new circumstances. They spoke Luwian, a language related to Hittite, and used a hieroglyphic writing system different from the cuneiform of the empire. They maintained some artistic and religious traditions, but they were organized on a much smaller scale. City-states and small kingdoms rather than a centralized empire. Further east in northern Syria, a similar pattern emerged. Cities that had been part of the Hittite sphere survived as independent kingdoms. Carchemish, Hamath, and others became centers of Neo-Hittite culture. They traded with the Phoenician cities to the west and with Assyria to the east. They preserved knowledge of ironworking and other technologies. They adapted to the post-collapse world. Assyria's story is particularly interesting because Assyria actually grew stronger during the period when most others were collapsing. The Assyrian kingdom in northern Mesopotamia had been a second-tier power during the late Bronze Age, overshadowed by the Hittites, Egyptians, and Babylonians. But Assyria had always been tough, situated in a difficult environment that rewarded military strength and administrative efficiency. When the Hittite Empire fell, Assyrian kings saw opportunity. They expanded into northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, territories that had been Hittite. They rebuilt trade routes, now controlled by Assyrian merchants and protected by Assyrian military power. They adopted iron weapons enthusiastically and developed cavalry forces that gave them military advantages. By the 10th century BCE, Assyria was emerging as the strongest power in the Near East. This wasn't despite the Bronze Age collapse. It was because of it. The collapse removed Assyria's main rival, the Hittites, and weakened Babylon. Assyria filled the vacuum, eventually building an empire that would dominate the region for 3 centuries. In the southern Levant, in what's now Israel and Palestine, an entirely new people were emerging from the collapse. The highland regions that had been sparsely populated during the Bronze Age saw a sudden proliferation of small farming settlements starting around 1200 BCE. These were simple communities, each with a few dozen to a few hundred people, practicing subsistence agriculture and herding. Who were they? The archaeological evidence suggests they were a mix. Some were probably refugees from collapsing Canaanite cities on the coast. Some were former pastoral nomads settling into agriculture. Some were escaped workers from the palace economies. They clustered in the hill country, away from the old centers of power, and developed their own distinct culture. These are the early Israelites, the people who would eventually create the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and whose religious traditions would profoundly shape world history. They emerged directly from the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, building new communities in territories that the old palace systems had left marginal. On the coast, in what's now the Gaza Strip and southern Israel, the Peliset, one of the Sea Peoples groups, settled and became the Philistines. Egyptian power had contracted, leaving these coastal areas open. The Philistines established a confederation of cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. They brought with them pottery styles and architectural features from the Aegean world, evidence of their origins. The Philistines would be rivals and sometimes enemies of the early Israelites, conflicts preserved in biblical narratives like David and Goliath. But they were also an important link in the slowly rebuilding trade networks, connecting the Levantine coast with Cyprus, and eventually with the recovering Aegean world. What's striking about all these survival stories is their diversity. Egypt survived through continuity and geographic advantages. The Phoenician cities survived through adaptation and decentralization. Cyprus survived by becoming a refuge and melting pot. The Neo-Hittite states preserved some traditions while scaling down. Assyria turned the collapse into an opportunity for expansion. New peoples like the Israelites and Philistines emerged to fill empty territories. There wasn't one formula for survival. Different strategies worked in different circumstances, but some patterns emerge. Geographic protection helped, whether the desert barriers around Egypt or the insularity of Cyprus. Flexibility and decentralization helped, as the Phoenicians demonstrated. Military strength helped Assyria. Finding a niche in a chaotic landscape helped the Israelites. And crucially, none of these survivors tried to rebuild the Bronze Age palace system. That model was finished. The kingdoms and cities that emerged from the collapse were organized differently. They had more diverse power structures, merchant classes with independent wealth, more decentralized control of resources. Even in places that still had kings, the kings weren't the absolute centers of the economy the way Bronze Age palace rulers had been. The survivors were building something new. They didn't necessarily intend to. They were just adapting to circumstances, doing what worked in their particular situation. But collectively they were creating the foundations of the Iron Age world, a world that would be more decentralized, more dynamic, more open to innovation than the Bronze Age had been. By 900 BCE, 200 years after the worst of the collapse, these survival stories are starting to connect. Phoenician merchants are trading with Cyprus. Cypriot copper is reaching the Levant and the emerging Neo-Hittite states. Assyrian power is expanding, bringing some stability to northern Mesopotamia and Syria. Egypt is beginning to reunify, and in Greece something is stirring. The Dark Age is starting to lighten. It's 900 BCE, and in Greece the darkness is beginning to lift. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but gradually. You can see signs of recovery. The population has stopped falling and is beginning to grow again. New settlements are being established. Pottery is becoming more sophisticated. Trade contacts are extending beyond purely local exchanges, and crucially, contact with the outside world is resuming. Phoenician merchants are beginning to visit Greek ports. They come from Tyre and Sidon, their ships loaded with luxury goods, jewellery, carved ivory, fine textiles, metalwork. They're looking for markets, and even Dark Age Greece has things the Phoenicians want. Silver from the mines at Laurion near Athens, slaves captured in local conflicts, agricultural products, and increasingly manufactured goods as Greek artisans relearn old skills and develop new ones. These Phoenician contacts are transformative. They're bringing Greeks back into the Mediterranean trade network after 2 or 3 centuries of isolation. They're bringing ideas, new pottery styles that Greek artisans will adapt, new motifs in art, like the sphinxes and griffins that will become common in Greek decoration, and most importantly, the alphabet. Around 800 BCE, give or take a few decades, the Greeks adopt the Phoenician alphabet and modify it for their own language. The key innovation is adding vowels. Phoenician, like Hebrew and Arabic, is written with only consonants. The reader has to supply the vowels from context. This works well for Semitic languages, but poorly for Greek, where vowels carry more grammatical information. So the Greeks took some Phoenician consonants they didn't need and repurposed them as vowels: alpha, epsilon, iota, omicron, upsilon. The first true alphabet, representing both consonants and vowels, was born. This might seem like a technical detail, but it's world-changing. The Greek alphabet was easier to learn and use than any previous writing system. Literacy could spread beyond a scribal elite. By the 7th century BCE, Greeks were scratching graffiti on pottery, writing personal names, making notes. Writing had become a tool accessible to anyone, not a specialized skill requiring years of training. And what do the Greeks write with their new alphabet? Poetry. The oral traditions that had been maintained through the Dark Age begin to be written down. Sometime around 750 to 700 BCE, probably, someone records the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great epic poems, attributed to Homer. These epics preserve memories of the Bronze Age, the palaces and the heroes, mixed with Dark Age elaborations and the poet's genius. They become foundational texts for Greek culture, but the Homeric epics also reveal something important about the world emerging from the Dark Age. They celebrate individual excellence, heroic virtue, personal honor. These are values that make sense in a decentralized world of autonomous communities, not in palace economies where everyone follows bureaucratic orders. The epics are both looking back to a mythical past and expressing the values of the emerging present. By 800 BCE, a new form of political organisation is crystallizing in Greece, the polis, the city-state. These aren't the palace-centred kingdoms of the Bronze Age. They're communities of citizens, free men who own their own land, participate in government, and fight in the community's defence. The polis centres on an urban area with surrounding agricultural territory. Citizens gather in assembly to make decisions. They elect or choose leaders, but those leaders rule with the community's consent, not by palace bureaucratic control. The earliest polis are simple and small. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, Sparta, Argos. Each controls a limited territory. Each is independent. They often fight each other, but they also trade, make alliances, and share a common culture, language, religion, and now a common alphabet. This is a new model of political organisation, and it will prove extraordinarily innovative. The polis model allows for experimentation. Different cities try different political systems. Some have kings, some have aristocratic councils, some develop more democratic systems where a broader range of citizens participate in decisions. The diversity creates a kind of political laboratory where ideas compete and evolve. And the economic model is different too. These aren't palace economies with centralised control and redistribution. These are market economies where individuals own property, produce goods, and trade them in markets. Merchants operate independently. Artisans own their workshops. Farmers own their land. The polis provides a legal and military framework, but it doesn't control the economy in detail the way Bronze Age palaces did. This creates dynamism. If you're a skilled potter in 7th century BCE Greece, you can make pottery and sell it for profit. If you develop a better technique or a more attractive style, you can become wealthy. Innovation is rewarded. Competition drives quality improvements. The pottery from this period, proto-geometric and then geometric styles, shows rapid development. Artists are experimenting, trying new approaches, competing for customers. The same pattern appears in other crafts. Metalworking advances as iron technology matures. Shipbuilding improves, with Greeks building faster and more seaworthy vessels. Agricultural techniques develop as farmers try new crops and methods. The economy is growing, and growth is creating wealth that can support art, architecture, and eventually philosophy and literature. By 750 BCE, Greeks are beginning to explore beyond their immediate waters. They're venturing to the Black Sea, to southern Italy and Sicily, to North Africa, to Spain, and where they find good harbours and fertile land, they establish colonies, new polis founded by settlers from old ones. These colonies aren't controlled by the mother cities. They're independent polis in their own right. But they maintain connections, trade, cultural exchange, family ties. This colonial expansion spreads Greek culture across the Mediterranean. It also spreads the polis model. Dozens, eventually hundreds of Greek city-states are established from the Black Sea to southern France. They interact with indigenous peoples, trade, sometimes conflict, sometimes mix. The Greek world becomes much larger than just Greece. The colonies also serve as laboratories for political innovation. Freed from old traditions and established aristocracies, colonial cities experiment with more radical forms of government. The idea that citizens should be equal before the law, that government should be accountable to the governed. These ideas develop partly in the colonial cities and are then imported back to Old Greece. Meanwhile, the alphabet is spreading beyond Greece. The Etruscans in Italy adopt a version of the Greek alphabet. From them, it will pass to the Romans. The Phrygians in Anatolia develop their own alphabetic script based on Greek. Eventually, alphabetic writing will spread across Europe and the Near East, replacing older syllabic and logographic systems almost everywhere. And it's not just Greece recovering. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the 9th and 8th centuries BCE are a period of renaissance. Phoenician cities are establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage on the North African coast, founded traditionally in 814 BCE. The Phoenician trade network reaches to Spain, to the Atlantic coast, to West Africa. Phoenician goods and the alphabet spread everywhere. In Anatolia, the kingdom of Phrygia is rising to prominence. The Phrygians, possibly descended from some of the groups who moved through the region during the collapse, control central Anatolia and trade with both the Greek cities and the Near East. Their legendary king Midas, whether he actually existed or not, represents the wealth of this kingdom. Assyria is becoming an empire. Under a series of aggressive kings in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, Assyria conquers territories across the Near East. They destroy the Kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. They extract tribute from Judah, Phoenicia, Cyprus. They invade Egypt in the 7th century BCE. The Assyrian military machine, based on iron weapons, cavalry, and siege technology, is the most powerful force in the region. But Assyrian conquest also has effects. It spreads technology and ideas. It creates a large trade network under Assyrian protection. It forces different peoples to interact and exchange knowledge. And paradoxically, the very success of Assyrian conquest will help create the conditions for the next great civilization to emerge, Persia. But that's still in the future. Egypt has reunified under the 25th dynasty, pharaohs from Nubia who adopt Egyptian culture and revive some of its old glories. Egypt isn't the superpower it was during the New Kingdom, but it's a significant player in Near Eastern politics again. Egyptian trade reaches the Greek world. Egyptian art influences Greek sculptors. The connections are rebuilding. By 700 BCE, 600 years after the collapse began, the Bronze Age world is genuinely gone. No one is trying to rebuild it. The palace economies aren't coming back. The old international system of great kings exchanging letters and gifts is over. But what's replaced it is, in many ways, more dynamic and innovative. The Iron Age Mediterranean is a world of city-states and merchant networks, of alphabetic literacy spreading to broader populations, of political experimentation and economic competition. It's more decentralized, which makes it more resilient. If one city is destroyed, others continue. If one trade route fails, merchants find another. There's redundancy in the system that the Bronze Age lacked. And the cultural achievements are building. Greek poets are creating literature, Phoenicians are exploring the known world. In Judah, religious thinkers are developing monotheism, the idea that there's only one God, and writing texts that will become the Hebrew Bible. Artists are creating styles that blend influences from Egypt, the Near East, and indigenous traditions into new syntheses. The classical world is being born. The Greece of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, of Athenian democracy and Spartan military culture, of Olympic games and Homeric epics, that Greece is emerging from the Dark Age. The Rome that will eventually build a Mediterranean-spanning empire is starting as a small city-state in Italy. The philosophical and religious traditions that will shape Western civilization are taking form. None of this could have happened without the Bronze Age collapse clearing away the old structures. The palace economies were stable but rigid. They didn't encourage innovation or allow for alternative forms of organization. The collapse destroyed them, and in the wreckage, new possibilities emerged. More freedom, more diversity, more experimentation. The people living through this rebirth didn't necessarily see it that way. They were just building their lives, founding their cities, writing their poems, trading their goods. But collectively, they were creating something unprecedented. A civilization based on citizen communities rather than palace bureaucracies, on market exchange rather than redistribution, on widely accessible literacy rather than scribal, elites. The foundations of the classical world, of democracy and philosophy and republican government, of individualism and civic virtue, were being laid in these centuries of recovery. The Bronze Age collapse was catastrophic. Civilizations fell, cities burned, people died, knowledge was lost. But what emerged from the ashes was, in crucial ways, better. More resilient, more innovative, more free. Sometimes systems have to collapse before something new can grow. The Bronze Age collapse proves that transformation, however painful, can ultimately be creative. That's the lesson that echoes across the centuries to us today. So here we are, over 3,000 years from the Bronze Age collapse, living in a world that would astound anyone from that ancient era. We have cities of millions, technologies that seem magical, global networks that connect everyone instantly. We've put it all together in ways the Bronze Age world never imagined. But the story of the collapse still matters, still speaks to us, still has lessons worth learning. Because here's what the Bronze Age collapse teaches us. Civilizations are more fragile than we think. The Bronze Age kingdoms seemed permanent to the people living in them. They had existed for centuries. They had sophisticated systems, international cooperation, impressive achievements. They seemed like they'd last forever. And then, within 50 years, they were gone. Not because the people were stupid or primitive, not because the systems were obviously flawed, but because complexity creates vulnerability and interconnection can turn one failure into a cascade. We live in a world that's vastly more interconnected than the Bronze Age ever was. Our supply chains span the globe, our food comes from dozens of countries, our electronics depend on materials mined on 6 continents, our economy runs on financial networks that circle the planet in milliseconds. This interconnection creates enormous benefits, prosperity and innovation that wouldn't be possible otherwise, but it also creates vulnerability. When one part of the system fails, the effects can ripple through the whole network. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us to build in redundancy, to maintain alternatives, to not assume that what works today will work forever. It reminds us that climate change is real and can have catastrophic effects. That mega drought helped destroy Bronze Age civilization. Our civilization is causing climate change on an even larger scale. The consequences might be worse. But the collapse also teaches us something hopeful. Humans are resilient. We survive, we adapt, we rebuild. The Bronze Age world fell, but people didn't disappear. They reorganized their societies. They preserved what knowledge they could. They created new forms of civilization from the wreckage. They survived the Dark Age and built something better on the other side. And what they built was more robust than what fell. The classical world that emerged from the collapse was more decentralized, more flexible, more innovative than the Bronze Age palace economies. It could absorb shocks that would have destroyed the centralized systems. It allowed for more diversity and experimentation. The collapse, terrible as it was for those who lived through it, ultimately enabled transformation. Think about the people who lived through the worst of it. The scribe at Pylos who carefully archived tablets as the palace burned. The refugees who sailed from the burning Mycenaean citadels to Cyprus or the Levantine coast. The farmers who rebuilt their lives in the Greek Dark Age. The Phoenician merchants who ventured into unknown waters looking for new trade routes. They didn't know if their efforts would matter. They couldn't see the classical world that would eventually emerge. They were just surviving, adapting, trying to build something for their children. But their efforts did matter. The knowledge they preserved, the communities they maintained, the innovations they developed, all of it fed into the rebirth. Classical Greece, the Phoenician trade networks, the Israelite kingdoms, the Neo-Hittite states, Assyrian Empire, all of it grew from seeds planted during the collapse and Dark Age. The scribes who kept writing even when palaces fell, the smiths who learned to work iron, the merchants who rebuilt trade routes, the poets who preserved oral traditions, they were all contributing to something larger than they could see. You are the descendant of people who survived the unsurvivable. Not just the Bronze Age collapse, but every catastrophe that humanity has faced. Ice ages and droughts and plagues and famines and wars and every other disaster you can name. Your ancestors survived them all. They adapted. They preserved knowledge. They rebuilt. They created new and better systems from the ruins of the old. That resilience is still in you. That capacity to adapt, to innovate, to maintain hope through darkness, to build something new when the old systems fail. It's your inheritance from those Bronze Age refugees and Dark Age farmers and Phoenician explorers and Greek poets. From all the unnamed people who kept going when everything seemed lost. The Bronze Age collapse happened over 3,200 years ago. The people who lived through it are long dead. The palaces they built are ruins. The tablets they wrote are museum pieces. But the story still matters because it's a human story. It's about how we build civilizations and how they fall. About how we survive catastrophe and how we rebuild. About fragility and resilience. About the end of one world and the beginning of another. If you've made it this far on this journey through time, thank you. Thank you for exploring this ancient mystery with me. Thank you for wondering about those people who lived through the collapse and those who built something new from the ashes. If you found this worthwhile, maybe hit that subscribe button, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how this story connects people across distance and time, and now, maybe it's time to rest, to let the story of the Bronze Age collapse settle in your mind, to drift off thinking about those ancient palaces and burning cities and refugees sailing into the unknown, and farmers in the Dark Age planting their crops and poets singing their songs and merchants rebuilding trade routes and smiths learning to work iron and all the countless unnamed people who kept civilization alive through the darkness. They survived, they adapted, they rebuilt, and their story continues in you. Sleep well.